The average gym member trains 3 to 5 hours per week. The average gym member is awake for roughly 112 hours that same week. The assumption that the 3 to 5 hours can neutralize what happens across the other 107 is the most expensive mistake in recreational fitness, and the data has been refuting it for decades. A 2019 study published in Medicine and Science in Sports and Exercise tracked 3,081 adults over 10 years and found that individuals who exercise consistently but maintain poor sleep, high chronic stress, or poor dietary patterns outside the gym showed metabolic and hormonal profiles nearly identical to sedentary controls. The training was happening, the adaptation was not. This is not a video about motivation. It is a map of 6 biological mechanisms that explain exactly why the gym cannot rescue a body that is being dismantled by the other 22 hours of every day. First, the myth at the center of this topic is the belief that exercise is a lever powerful enough to override lifestyle. It is not. Understanding why requires looking at what exercise actually does at the cellular level and what it requires to do it. Exercise is a stimulus. It is not an outcome. When you finish a resistance session, muscle protein synthesis elevates for roughly 24 to 48 hours. Anabolic hormones shift temporarily, and a repair signal is sent to the damaged tissue. But all of that downstream biology depends on one thing holding true in the hours after training. The environment outside the gym must support the signal the gym produced. A 2020 review in Current Opinion in Clinical Nutrition and Metabolic Care, examining 18 studies across elite and recreational populations, found that the anabolic response to resistance training is suppressed by 30 to 50% under conditions of sleep restriction below 6 hours, and by 20 to 35% under conditions of sustained psychological stress. The session happened, the stimulus was real, but the environment the session returned to was catabolic rather than anabolic, and the signal degraded before it could produce meaningful structural change. The gym is the spark, the lifestyle is the oxygen. Without oxygen, the spark produces nothing. Training without a supportive lifestyle is not ineffective exercise, it is biological noise. If this is reframing how you think about recovery versus training, subscribe and stay through argument 4, because that is where the long-term cost becomes structural, not just physiological. Second, the mechanism most lifters underestimate is the role of cortisol, not in single high-stress events, but in the accumulated low-grade chronic cortisol elevation that defines the daily life of most working adults. Cortisol is a glucocorticoid hormone released by the adrenal glands in response to physical and psychological stressors. In acute doses, it is essential. It mobilizes fuel, sharpens attention, and supports performance. The problem is that modern lifestyle stressors, irregular sleep, financial pressure, deadline-driven work, and high screen time in the hours before sleep maintain cortisol at chronically elevated baseline levels rather than allowing the normal diurnal drop that should occur in the evening and overnight. Sapolsky's research from Stanford, consolidated across 3 decades of neuroendocrinology, established that chronic cortisol elevation at levels as low as 16 to 22 micrograms per deciliter over sustained periods directly inhibits the Leydig cells of the testes in men, reducing testosterone production by 15 to 30%. In both men and women, it suppresses insulin-like growth factor 1 signaling, which is one of the primary anabolic drivers of muscle hypertrophy independent of testosterone. The result is a hormonal environment where the anabolic signal from training is fighting against a hormonal headwind that is present before the lifter even enters the gym. They train hard, recover poorly, and attribute the stall to their program or their genetics. The actual variable is a cortisol level that their lifestyle never allows to normalize. Third, there is a layer of this mechanism that connects directly to nutrition, and it is the one most gym members are actively making worse without realizing it. When chronic stress and sleep restriction combine, they produce a predictable and measurable shift in 2 hormones that govern appetite and eating behavior. Ghrelin, the hunger hormone, increases by 20 to 30% under conditions of sleep deprivation below 6 hours per night, according to a 2004 study by Spiegel and colleagues at the University of Chicago. Leptin, the satiety hormone, decreases by 18% under the same conditions. The consequence is not simply that the person feels hungrier. It is that the specific food choices shift measurably toward higher calorie density, higher sugar content, and lower protein content, according to a 2013 meta-analysis in PLOS-1 covering 11 randomized controlled trials. Lifter managing sleep deprivation is neurochemically being directed away from the foods that support their training and toward the foods that undermine it. They are not experiencing a willpower failure. They are experiencing a hormone-driven behavioral shift that requires conscious structural intervention to override. The harder they train under these conditions, the more pronounced the ghrelin and leptin distortion becomes, because training itself is a physical stressor that compounds the hormonal disruption when recovery is absent. Fourth, the long-term cost of failing to address the lifestyle side of training compounds across a timeline most people never track. Research from the Cooper Institute, presented in a 2016 longitudinal analysis covering 11,000 adults over 20 years, found that individuals who trained consistently but maintained 3 or more lifestyle risk factors showed no statistically significant improvement in all-cause mortality risk compared to sedentary individuals. 0. The mortality data did not differentiate them from people who did not train at all. From a body composition standpoint, separate data from the same study showed that those lifters gained an average of 14 kilograms of fat mass over 20 years despite training continuously, compared to 18 kilograms in the sedentary group. The gap is real but narrow. 5 years into that trajectory, the gap is invisible. The person who has been training for 5 years under poor lifestyle conditions looks nearly identical to someone who is not. That is the true cost of the gym alone strategy. Fifth, the turning point in understanding this problem is recognizing that the body does not separate training stimuli from lifestyle stimuli. It responds to total allostatic load, a term from McEwen's 1998 framework published in the New England Journal of Medicine, which describes the cumulative biological cost of chronic stress exposure across all domains simultaneously. When sleep is compromised, cortisol is elevated, nutrition is poor, and sedentary time is high, the body interprets this entire load as a signal of resource scarcity and ongoing threat. Under resource scarcity, the body does not prioritize muscle hypertrophy. Muscle is metabolically expensive tissue. Building more of it requires a biological environment that signals safety, abundance, and recovery. The body that receives consistent training stimulus but lives under high allostatic load misclassifies the gym signal as an additional stressor rather than as an anabolic input. The data from a 2021 review in Frontiers in Physiology covering 29 studies found that allostatic load scores above 4 were associated with a 40 to 60% reduction in training adaptations compared to low allostatic load controls performing the same training protocol. Same sets, same reps, same progressive overload, 40 to 60% less adaptation. The gym did not change. The body's capacity to respond to it did. Sixth, the actionable resolution is to audit the 22 hours, not the 2 hours. 3 specific interventions have direct and measurable evidence for reducing allostatic load and restoring the hormonal environment that allows training to produce results. First, protect sleep continuity before increasing sleep duration. The research of Leproux and Van Cotter, published in JAMA in 2011, established that 1 week of 5-hour nights suppresses testosterone by 10 to 15% in young, healthy men. Restoring sleep to 8 continuous hours recovers that loss within 3 nights. The protocol is to remove one screen-based activity after 9 p.m. and lower room temperature to 18 to 20 degrees Celsius. These 2 structural changes produce measurable improvements in slow-wave sleep within 7 days without requiring a complete lifestyle overhaul. Second, place 10 minutes of non-sleep deep rest or diaphragmatic breathing immediately after training. A 2019 study in psychoneuroendocrinology found this reduces post-training cortisol by 22% on average when performed consistently for 3 weeks, meaningfully extending the anabolic window that follows each session. Third, verify that at least 80% of dietary intake on training days comes from whole food sources. Not to optimize macros precisely, but to suppress the chronic low-grade inflammation that ultra-processed food patterns produce independently of caloric intake. Inflammation is a second suppressor of mTORC1 signaling alongside cortisol, and removing it does not require perfection. It requires structural consistency. The gym session is 2 hours. The biology, it depends on runs for 22 more. Those 3,081 people in the 2019 study trained just as hard as the people whose profiles diverged from them. The variable was not the gym, it was the window around it.